We are at the Teton Science School in Jackson. We're at a workshop for Wyoming and North Dakota social studies teachers, and that's brought to you by the We the People program and the Center for Civic Education with support from Wyoming Humanities. The general theme of this workshop is the state of our democracy and why citizenship and an understanding of our founding documents is so important. And we have a wonderful panel to help us kind of dissect the state of civics education. And I'd like to introduce our panel to you now. To my immediate left is Senator Doug Jones. He was elected to the United States Senate from the state of Alabama in 2018 in a special election and served through this year. Prior to serving in the Senate, Senator Jones served as the United States Attorney from the Northern District of Alabama from 1997 through 2001, and is best known for his prosecution of Thomas Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing case in Birmingham, where 4 young African American girls lost their lives. Senator Jones chronicles that experience in his book, Bending Towards Justice: The Birmingham Church Bombing That Changed the Course of Civil Rights, a book I highly recommend. Senator Jones, welcome to Wyoming.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
Dr. David Adler is the president of the Alturas Institute, a nonprofit organization created to promote the Constitution, gender equity, and civic education. A recipient of teaching, writing, and civic awards, Adler has lectured nationally and internationally and published widely on the Constitution, presidential power, and the Bill of Rights. Welcome, Dr. Adler.
Pleasure to be here.
And Meaghan Todd is a high school teacher, a high school social studies teacher at Laramie High School. Meaghan has been teaching since 2004 and is a master teacher and a mentor teacher and teaches primarily juniors and seniors at Laramie High School and is a We the People sponsor. Meaghan, thank you also for joining us. We have a lot to visit about today, and I want to start with you, Dr. Adler. You have written several columns, many of which have appeared in Wyoming newspapers. And recently you said in one of your columns this. You said that Americans rightly declared their affection, admiration, and even reverence for the Constitution, but too few can claim a working knowledge of it. Civic literacy, you said, is alarmingly low. Many citizens, for example, cannot name the rights protected in the First Amendment, the justices of the Supreme Court, or explain how the Electoral College works and key historical events that shaped our nation and influenced constitutional development. Why is civic literacy so low? And to all of you in just a moment, how can that be improved in such a politically polarized country?
Well, that's a great question. The reality is that civic education has not been emphasized adequately in this country for a very long time. We have dedicated teachers here in Wyoming and elsewhere who are steeped in knowledge of the Constitution and work very, very hard to educate their students. The problem isn't necessarily with current students. The problem has to do, I think, with people who graduated from high school and college years ago, didn't take enough classes on the Constitution and civic education, didn't quite emphasize those important events in our history that shaped American democracy. And furthermore, I think they don't quite appreciate the virtues and values of American constitutionalism. For example, they cannot name Supreme Court justices. They can't identify the powers of the 3 branches of government. I think that they don't quite understand just how important the Constitution is in their daily lives. After all, the Constitution is the linchpin for American democracy. And so it's necessary to heighten the awareness and the understanding and the knowledge of American citizens about how the Constitution governs this country and why our government needs to be held accountable to it.
So Meaghan, before I turn to you, how do we do that in such a politically polarized environment? Where can anyone who's watching turn to learn?
Well, there are a number of places where that can be done. Turning certainly to the work of the very good work of the We the People program here in Wyoming. There are a number of...
Even adults?
Even adults can do that. In my case, the Alturas Institute, which I serve as president, is dedicated to the promotion of the Constitution, civic education, gender equality, and equal protection. We're all over the country providing workshops, seminars, conferences. In addition to that, people should pick up the Constitution. Justice Hugo Black used to carry a copy around with them on a daily basis. And people can familiarize themselves with the language of the text of the Constitution. And beyond that, certainly there are any number of very good books that people can read to begin to understand the founding of American constitutionalism and how the three branches exercise their powers, and to fully appreciate the nature and impact of the Bill of Rights. So the educational materials are available. What we have to do is to impress upon the American citizenry the great need to better understand how the Constitution can work on behalf of their interests in promoting American democracy.
And that information is certainly available, even at your local library.
Yes.
You teach students all of the time. Meaghan, what is it that you're trying to impart on them about our Constitution?
I believe that, and we were alluding to this earlier today, that our Constitution gets understated in so much of what we talk about, and students don't always understand that it is foundational. We hold it above other things, and if it is the foundation, you can't move forward without understanding all of those details, all of those clauses, all of those things that we throw it around a lot. This is unconstitutional, that's unconstitutional. How do we know? How do we know what is and is not constitutional if we're not looking at the Constitution? So I have a personal love of the Constitution, and I hope my students walk away with a love of the Constitution, knowing that it is a very short and complicated document, that in 8,000 words, they did their best attempt at making a more perfect union. And I think that without looking at the document itself, you don't know your role in that whole picture. So I try and remind my students that it's not something that was written a long time ago, that happened, forever ago, but it still drives our foundations of what we do, rule of law, things that matter to us. We hear in the news all the time, but we have no clue what they mean. You would have a much broader understanding of all sorts of things in our country if you just simply picked up the U.S. Constitution, looked at, and not just the document itself, but understanding the debate behind it, the debate that continues with it, and just that lack of knowledge leaves a lot of room for misinformation that unfortunately both students and adults seem to be kind of living within, is this misunderstanding.
Its history is just fascinating. Senator Jones, why is Americans' constitutional literacy maybe at an all-time low?
Because people focus, I believe, on the interpretations of the Constitution that are coming out every day, whether it's the Supreme Court or a political pundit or someone. They focus on the interpretations and not, as Meaghan just said, they don't focus on the nuts and bolts. They don't read the Constitution, how it came into being, and the give and take among those that were at that Constitutional Convention in 1789, how it came to be that they worked together to form that, and the nuts and bolts, and how Article 1, 2, and 3, the legislative, executive, and judiciary, not just work together, but there's checks and balances. The checks and balances of our constitutional system are completely lost on people today. They need to know that the executive branch of government has limited power for a reason. They need to know that the legislative branch has limited power for a reason, and judiciary has limited power, but they check each other's power. That is the beauty of the United States Constitution. It is not the three branches of government, it's the checks and balances. And it's those nuts and bolts of how the Constitution was formed and not getting confused in the various interpretations. Everyone talks about what does the Constitution say? What is the interpretation? What is the rule of law? Well, we have 9 people on the Supreme Court for a reason. Not everybody agrees on that interpretation. Not everybody agrees on what the definition of the rule of law is. But everyone can pretty much agree on the literal language of the Constitution and the beauty of that document that has survived now and is going to hopefully continue to survive for a very long time. And I think we've gotten away from that, and we focus so much more on what people are interpreting the Constitution to say and not exactly how it was formed and what it says. And if we can get back to that a little bit, I think we can put aside the partisan issues and focus on how this country was founded, why it was founded, and the give and take, including the fact that the Bill of Rights wasn't contained in the original Constitution. The first 10 amendments were not contained. That was at the insistence of Thomas Jefferson, who was the ambassador to France at the time. And when he saw the Constitution that had been signed, he said, wait a minute, you've left out fundamental rights of the free press and religion, the fundamental right of firearms, you know, the Second Amendment, due process that's in the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments. Those came a little bit later. And understanding how those came to be, not what they've been interpreted to be over the last 2 centuries, but how they came to be, I think, would be incredibly important, and how those amendments were then incorporated to the states with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that outlawed slavery after the war, and you incorporated those and imposed those liberties, those freedoms, and those rights on all citizens, and saying that the states couldn't take away from them either. That's what we do, I think.
Meaghan, I thought about you when I thought about this. A couple of years ago, there was a news story that I read then and reread in preparation for this interview that talked about 8 social studies textbooks, maybe books very similar to what you use in your classroom. The books had the same publisher, the story said. They credit the same authors, but they are customized for students in different states, and their content sometimes diverge in ways that reflect the nation's deepest partisan divides. So my question is it undesirable to have a single narrative of American history? Is that even possible? So do we even know if what you're teaching your students in Laramie, Wyoming is similar to what the senator here learns from what he understands about students how in Alabama and how they learn? Does that concern you?
Well, early on many years ago in college, I had a great professor who just reminded me that textbooks are a best attempt, and maybe not always in the most noble of intents, to put words to many, many, many stories. And so I've never been overly dependent on one textbook. I understand their role, but for me, I'm a huge fan of more kind of primary source document things that we cannot say, well, this author says these things. Where did that come from? Where did we get those ideas? Where do we find those in the historical record? I think the Constitution alone kind of speaks for itself. Even if it doesn't, there's enough out there to, for example, the National Constitution Center has a fabulous website. I recommend it to many people. If you just want to read the Constitution, that's there. But it also provides context, what was going on historically, and this is my favorite part, it shows that there are parts of the Constitution that we still don't agree on, and here's a scholarly thought about this side of the argument, and here's a scholarly thought about this side of the argument, so you can have reasonable debate about those things without, because I want my students to think. I don't want them to just read it in a book and trust it. I don't know that that's healthy. I don't think that makes them very good critical thinkers, and so letting them work through the scholarship around those things about a document that is pretty short, but they can hear from many voices about what that might mean both historically and in context. So I just try and remind them that they didn't always agree on what it meant, and we aren't always going to agree on what it meant, but at the end of the day, we have to come to some common understanding to move forward, and maybe that is arguably different in context of the world we live in than what they were experiencing, but that's still the foundation. And so I always try and go to the source, because you never know, like news, you never know where did this information come from, and so digesting a large body of news, I think, is a good piece of advice as well.
Senator Jones or Dr. Adler, does it bother you at all that there's not a single narrative of American history in regards to the Constitution?
It bothers me a hell of a lot. Sure. It bothers me an awful lot.
Now, with all due respect, and we talked a little bit about this off camera, how can you have a civil discussion about that being a Democrat in a very Republican state?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult because of the partisan nature of where we find ourselves in politics these days. Between media and social media, it's very difficult because everybody thinks someone else has an agenda. And if you talk about civic education, you talk about the Constitution, there shouldn't be an agenda behind it. But history is based on facts. It shouldn't be based on someone's agenda. In Alabama, just last year, that our state archives that have been in existence over 120 years now, our state archives had to acknowledge that they came into existence for a false purpose, and that was to glorify the Confederacy as opposed to giving a true narrative of the history of Alabama. So we've seen throughout the years how history has been distorted. And it is very difficult, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It does not mean that we shouldn't try to give everybody a basic set of facts. What we're missing in this world today, in my view, because of potentially social media and everything, is if we don't have the same set of facts that people, and then you can have those interpretations. You can talk about that. But we should always, I think, strive for a narrative that is consistent from Alabama to Wyoming, from Maine to the southern parts of California. It's difficult in this day and age, I get it. And to do that, you're going to have to rewrite some of our history books that have slanted those views exactly the way you said. It is unconscionable that a publisher would publish 9 different history books based on the political consequences, the political affiliations of the area where those books are going. That is unconscionable to me. And maybe they ought to send 9 books to every school in America and make the kids read all 9 of them to understand what's going on.
Dr. Adler, it seems impossible to accomplish what the senator envisions, to me.
Well, I'm very sympathetic to what Meaghan and the senator have said. Textbooks that don't tell the full story, don't tell the truth about events in our history, do a disservice to today's students. And we don't want our students to grow up and to become full-fledged citizens based on learning that is essentially falsified. I'm sympathetic to textbook writers. I've done some, and it's very difficult, and I've critiqued textbooks and scholarly articles. But the reality is that so often textbook writers are encouraged by publishers to whitewash certain very difficult, challenging times and situations in America because they're afraid of the harsh reaction. And that reflects your question about the political paralysis and the polarization in our country. So this is why I think master teachers like Meaghan take it upon themselves to supplement the textbooks by bringing scholarly articles to bear that can drill down on the kinds of issues that students need to understand that are sensitive issues. And while textbook writers are a little bit daunted by the politics, master teachers can find the courage to serve the interests of their students, to thus serve the interests of Wyoming and the nation by asking them to read scholarly articles or at least snippets which make points on both sides so that students can develop their critical analytical skills. That's the best thing teachers can do.
So I want to bend this discussion now towards civil discourse. Because you were talking about that, I think.
Yes.
Al Simpson, in a 2016 forum I attended, said the following. He said that there were people in the audience that hate Hillary Clinton, and there are people in the audience that hate Donald Trump. They don't dislike them, and I'm quoting here, they hate them. And hate corrodes the container it's carried in. And that is where our country is today, end quote. Governor Sullivan, who was also at the forum, said then that he hoped we weren't following that in Wyoming, but even then, he was concerned. And I don't want to speak for either Senator Simpson or Governor Sullivan, but I think it's plausible that both are far more concerned today. Each of you, what are your thoughts?
Well, certainly Senator Jones knows Senator Simpson well. He served with him. I came to know Senator Simpson a bit because we made joint appearances at different universities on panels, and I admire his good work. I think he's absolutely right. The fact that people would resort to the use of that venomous, very harsh word hate reflects, I think, their general ignorance of the politics, the policies behind the work done in Washington or even the Wyoming legislature. Why are we so quick to jump to say, I hate this person or hate that person? It's really not what we feel. I think the explanation has a lot to do with the fact that People over time develop their sense of identity by their attachment to a political party or to a set of secular principles, almost to the extent that it's a religious fervor, which is really unfortunate. And I think also it reflects the fact in this polarized period that people want so badly to triumph in the political world, which means they want to win at all costs. They'll engage in demagoguery. They'll use the worst, harsh language, which undermines civil discourse. And they have forfeited the very idea of compromise, which is the engine of democracy. And without a willingness of legislators in Wyoming or in the nation's capital to try to reach a compromise, our democracy falters. And that's what we're facing today.
Meaghan, I'm going to let you go last, and I'm going to tenor my question to you a little bit differently. But Senator, what are your thoughts about civil discourse here?
I think we are in a really tough place in this country right now with that. People cannot talk to each other. They can't engage in the political discussions. Even in the Senate, I saw that happening. You know, I was lucky in my 3 years. I was always named one of the most bipartisan senators. And you cannot participate in a bipartisan exercise without being civil and respecting each other. It's one of the reasons I would go with our now late friend Mike Enzi to the Senate prayer breakfast every Wednesday to try to make sure that we got away from the politics. And we could talk about things as equals. We could talk about things together. We could disagree, but we could disagree without being disagreeable. And we could have a civil discourse. We could talk about the issues of the day, trying to find common ground. That's what's lost today, I think, in the Senate. It was not the Senate that I worked for as a young staffer when Al Simpson was first elected to Congress. And I had a picture of Senator Simpson, an autographed picture in my office 30 years after the fact, almost 40 years, I guess, after the fact. But I think today we've got to pull back a little bit. We've got to get away. Social media has given us an opportunity to say things behind closed doors that we would have, at one point in our lives, would have never said openly to anyone. And once you start saying that in social media, though, then you're okay with doing it face to face. And we've got to get away from that. I still believe, I still have the hope that there are people up there that are doing that are pushing that are going to continue to try to do that. But it's pushing the ball uphill right now with the way, because everything is very toxic. Democrats look at Republicans in a toxic way. Republicans look at Democrats in a toxic way, and they don't try to figure out where there is common ground. And if they did, they would find there's a heck of a lot more common ground on these major issues that we're facing. Infrastructure, voting, election integrity. There's so much more common ground if they would just look for it as opposed to staying in partisan corners. And that's civil discourse. That is being civil to each other and respectful, because you not only talk to somebody, you listen to them, you understand where they're coming from. And if you can do that, I just think we could really make some significant progress in this country.
Meaghan, I guess you have students that disagree on some issues in your classroom. How do you guide them to talk about those disagreements?
Well, I have in my classroom a soapbox that my husband built for me.
Literally a soapbox.
Yes. And I don't get on it often, but I do get on it. I'm short, so that works out really great. And I get on my soapbox at the beginning of the year, and I very clearly outline our rules for discussion. And I remind them that although they may not see examples of this kind of discussion in maybe the Senate or in the House or in their homes or in their neighborhoods or their world, that the classroom is a perfect place to take on those tasks of practicing that discourse in a way that they can walk away from the classroom and say, we disagreed, and that's okay. We can still go to lunch together. We can still be friends. And so I kind of set a tone that this is how we talk about these things. And I don't shirk away from controversial things. I know some teachers do. I don't think that's reasonable, because if we don't practice talking about those things, but at the same time, when they are getting a little bit fiery and maybe not, and I always say they're more like guidelines, not so much rules, but when I see that happening, I'll get up my soapbox and just send a friendly reminder. This is how we are going to engage with this, because we won't do it out there unless we practice it in here. So it's a passion of mine to help them do better than maybe what they've experienced in other arenas.
I'm going to go back to Alabama and convince the legislature to get soapboxes for every teacher in the state of Alabama. That's a great idea.
I think it may be a good idea.
Sure is.
One more question directly, Meaghan. What do you tell your students about what happened in the United States Capitol on January 6th?
Well, we were in school, obviously, when it happened. And, at first, students were kind of in shock. We don't expect these sorts of things to happen. There was a lot of there wasn't a clear picture of even at that point what happened. And since then, obviously, we've gotten a clearer picture. I always remind my students, though, that regardless of what their feelings are about that the facts have to be discovered. We have to know what happened on that day, and I think that rule of law plays into that. The evidence, we are not a nation of feelings about law, we are a nation of rule of law. And so doing the work to find out essentially what did happen. We are in Wyoming, we were not there. We don't know, we're pretty far removed. And so I don't think there's any harm, I suppose, in trying to decide or trying to investigate. We've done that in every other major event of this nature. I don't think there's, but also to then read the report. Don't just trust the media. Look at what was reported, what was witnessed, etc. Because I think that will make them better consumers of that for themselves instead of just hearsay from the news.
Dr. Adler, few in the country understand the Constitution like you do. Relative to the Constitution, what went through your mind on January 6th?
Well, it was horrifying because it represented a clear insurrection against the American government for the purpose of halting a critical measure, a critical event in our constitutional history for the selection of the president. It was an attack on American democracy to halt the vote count for the Electoral College. And that kind of assault on American government is as fundamentally critical to the maintenance of our constitutional system as any internal or domestic act I can conceive of. It's the equivalent of a foreign nation bombing the United States and halting our governmental practices. And I think it's critical for American citizens to understand that parallel, that day, the assault on our Capitol was the equivalent of a foreign nation attacking our government to halt our democracy. And so for Americans, as they watch the coverage, and indeed I hope they tune into the investigation now underway, conducted by the House of Representatives, and they listen to the testimony of the Capitol officers who will say they feared for their lives, they were beaten, they were crushed. There was no respect for law and order. It certainly is not the case, as some members of the GOP will maintain, including, for example, Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson, who said it was essentially a peaceful, loving crowd, or it's not, as Donald Trump has claimed, about kisses and hugs. This was a vicious, violent assault on the citadel of American democracy.
There are many in Wyoming who will take an opposite position from what you just described. And Senator, you had just served until days before and then watched what happened in your former chamber. What went through your mind?
I was crushed. That is a sacred place. At one point I had my wife on the floor of the Senate and they wouldn't even let my wife touch that desk, much less rifle through it. It is a sacred place. But I think it's important to remember, because I understand that there are different views. But really, when we're talking about January 6th, let's talk about, we've really got two separate extracurricular events. We've got a rally on the mall, and then we got the attack on the Capitol. The rally on the mall was a protest. It was people there that were pro-Donald Trump. They felt like he got a bad rap. I get that. I understand it. But despite what I believe is behind that, it doesn't matter. That's why they were there. A lot of those people went on to the Capitol, but the others that went to that Capitol for the sole purpose of interrupting the constitutional process that Dr. Adler talked about, and they did it with violence. You cannot look at what happened that day, the viciousness with the attacks on the police officers, the breaking of the United States Capitol, the chants to hang Mike Pence, hang the Vice President of the United States, building a noose out there. If that had been on any other day, it would have been called a riot. But because of that constitutional duty that was going on inside that Capitol that day, that every member of the House and every member of the Senate was sworn to do, they were trying to stop that. They were wanting to make sure that that did not happen, and that is nothing short of an insurrection. So people need to keep in mind, there will be those that try to connect the two events with the speakers, whether it is the former president or others. That can remain for a lot of interpretation. But there were two events. There was a rally, and then there was what I believe to be, under the classic definition, an insurrection. And folks need to look at that. Look at what happened. You cannot look at the violence that occurred and think anything short of the fact that our democracy was in peril that day, and but for those brave Capitol Police officers, reinforcements coming in from the military, and Northern Virginia and Maryland police officers, that people would have died. I mean, people and the members of Congress and potentially the Vice President of the United States would have died. And that would have sent this country into an absolute chaotic result that we have not seen the likes of since the war in 1861 between the North and the South. And I hope people will look at that and look at those facts, look at the videos, listen to the cries for help from those police officers, see the bear spray. Folks out here know what bear spray is. See that was focused right at Capitol Police officers.
Dr. Adler?
Well, and may I say that the senator is quite correct. For those who don't want to quite believe the presentation of the facts as we've just recited them, they should study very carefully the footage, the live, real, up-to-date time coverage of that insurrection and that attack. That footage doesn't lie, so we hope that citizens will in fact follow the facts. You know, our founders were children of the Enlightenment. They believed, in fact, in the idea of facts and truth and evidence. Here, the facts and truth and the evidence are on the screen before them. And so if they're not going to accept this presentation of facts, then they're simply delusional. They are fooling themselves into accepting or embracing some other version that satisfies a political agenda. But American democracy adheres to the proposition that facts and truth and evidence should guide our way.
Let's turn the page, if we may, just for a moment. In a workshop with North Dakota and Wyoming teachers that you're going to conduct here a little bit later in this process here in Jackson, you're going to talk about the challenges that we might face relative to the threats against American constitutional democracy in the 21st century, led by Senator Jones and Dr. Adler. What are those threats? What should Americans be keen to relative to threats against our democracy? What are you going to tell these Wyoming and North Dakota teachers?
I'm going to let our constitutional scholar go first on that. I think he's written on this.
Thank you. So I think there are a number of threats. One is the very issue that we're describing today, a deficit in civic understanding, because democracy cannot thrive if we do not have an informed, participatory citizenry. That's number one. Number two, I think Americans have to appreciate the virtues and values of constitutionalism, that the Constitution is the first and final frontier for promoting American democracy. And that means that that citizens have to find ways not only to enhance their knowledge, but to participate in an informed way. And the front burner issues certainly include this excessive partisanship. More than that, they have to understand that the Senate needs to fulfill its duties and responsibilities, live up to the doctrine of checks and balances, not merely in holding the president accountable, but following its own duties under the Constitution, to take seriously once more the advice and consent clause of Article 2, that the Senate also has to be fair and faithful in carrying out its duties, that in fact it cannot succumb to a president of either party who wants to steamroll the United States Senate and deny it the importance of carrying out its institutional goals, responsibilities, and powers. And then we have a whole long list of policy issues, Craig, and that is that there has to be an effort by Congress to restore the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to preserve and protect the right of Americans everywhere across this country to vote, and that means taking seriously the congressional duty under Article 1, Section 4, ultimately to regulate elections in this country, not falling prey to the argument that states are supposed to regulate elections. States have that authority initially, but Congress has, according to the framers of the Constitution, the critical responsibility to ensure that these regulations are uniform and promote the interests of the country. We need to take seriously such issues as infrastructure, adequately funding education. We've got to make sure that wages in this country rise to the level where working families can support themselves. There's a very long list, Craig, of things that have to be done to meet the challenges in the 21st century.
With all due respect, many watching will say you're reciting the Democratic agenda here.
Well, if it's not the Democratic agenda, it should be the agenda of many citizens, because I think our viewers would want to know, don't they have a right to a living wage? Don't they agree that all Americans should be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote, that it should not just be a privilege for a few, that in fact state legislatures do not have the authority to pass repressive voting measures that will deny Black Americans, other minorities, the elderly, the right to vote? Don't they also believe in the future of their children, which is to provide affordable education to everybody? Don't they believe in the right of people to feed themselves, to house themselves, to access medical care? So I don't think that's necessarily a democratic agenda. It's an agenda for America in the 21st century.
Meaghan, I'll have you go next here. From your perspective as a teacher, what do you think are the threats that are out there to American democracy? Have you given that any thought?
On occasion. Mm-hmm. I think from a teacher's perspective, over the years, and I do not mean to discredit STEM curriculum, because I think it's fabulous, but there has been such an emphasis on math, technology, engineering, etc., almost to the detriment of civics education. I feel like I saw the writing on the wall when I first started teaching, and it seems to have come to fruition that we don't have a rigorous emphasis on civic education. And it just blows my mind that we, like in some Wyoming schools, they do not require a extensive government class, which blows my mind, because I think that is every person, regardless of their career, should be a part-time citizen of the United States. Like they're like that should be their part-time job. Is that like that's part of who they are, not regardless of what their career is. That beyond that, they should engage with this this government that we've created, because it's our government, really. So I would just say that it's concerning, and I hope that we can remedy some of those things, that we would put an emphasis once again on the foundations that everyone should walk away with, I think. Mm-hmm. Whether that be, and also it should start earlier, but mm-hmm. that's another issue. But at a minimum, that they can, as they're approaching voting age, that they have the knowledge, the capacity to understand how the system works, how to hold the system accountable when they need to. And so I'd say that's a concern that I take very personally, because I want to try and kind of remedy some of those things.
Sure. Senator Jones, greatest threats here?
Well, I think the answers of my colleagues here were fabulous, number one. I'll just expand on something that I think right now, and that is, and I put it this way, I think the lack of confidence in our elections today represents the greatest threat to this country and our future. And I put that in both Republican, Democrat, lack of confidence. Right now, we have seen a lot of people over the last few years that lost confidence in the November election, despite what they may have heard. And you never hear me talking about big lies or anything like that. But there's a huge segment of people who have no confidence in the November elections as how they turned out. In response to some of that, I think state legislatures are going overboard the other way. And many of the measures that they're passing in Georgia and in other places have nothing to do with building confidence. They have nothing. I mean, for instance, you narrow the number of hours to vote. You stop the voting day at 5 o'clock instead of 7. Are they trying to tell the people of their state that only fraudsters come out at night? I don't think so. There are political things at work in that. But the fact is, folks on President Trump supporters and so many others lost confidence in the elections in November this past year. And now you've got Democrats and folks from moderates to the left that are losing confidence for the elections going forward. That is not healthy for America when everyone loses confidence. So I think the challenge is to not put voting rights in the context simply of access to voting. But if the Congress of the United States could exercise the authority they do have under the Constitution, it is specifically in the Constitution that they have the authority to regulate federal elections. Have uniform standards that are the same people are playing by the same rules in Wyoming that we play by in Alabama. They play by the same rules across. Give folks early access to voting, easier mail-in votings. You can do those in very secure ways. But that confidence builds when everyone is playing by the same rules and you know where you are and you don't let partisan election officials, like partisan legislatures, decide the outcome of an election. That is not going to instill confidence in a huge swath of the public in that state. Even in a state like Wyoming, you will have a large number of people that would be disillusioned, that would disagree with that would lose confidence in that. Take that away. Have these uniform standards. It's exactly what I've been talking about. You can take portions of H.R. 1, portions of the Voting Rights Act, and add some others to do those things necessary. I really believe we can talk about the inequities in society for health care, for education opportunities, for business opportunities, for all citizens. We can talk about those, and there are things that we can do. But to me, confidence in our elections is at its all-time low, and we are endangering this country, because if it remains that way, we will see more of what happened on January 6th. And we will be moving more toward an autocratic government that I don't think anybody on the right or the left really want.
Lots to talk about, and we could continue this discussion for hours, but let's end on something maybe a little bit lighter. Summertime. We don't have beaches in Wyoming, but we all have time to read a little bit. Other than your great book, Bending Toward Justice, what's on the reading list this summer? Either maybe for students or for adults or for both. What would you recommend to us if we have a little bit of time to grab one more book? Who wants to go first?
I'm happy to recommend any number of books that I've been reading this summer, and they are great books by female authors telling the story of courageous women who have pursued their missions and their pursuits. Consider Elizabeth Becker's You Don't Belong Here Anymore, Judy Battalion's fine book, The Light of Days, or Dorothy Wickenden's book, The Antagonist. Each one of these books describes brave, courageous women who are trying to pursue their goals and missions against the walls that often close in and deny women gender equality in this country.
Anyone else? Top of mind?
You know, I read a lot of nonfiction. And with my career and where we are in this country, I've been focused a little bit on trying to read as much as I can on the issues of race and to some extent history, as we talked about. There's a book called Caste that is just pretty phenomenal. I think that needs to be on everybody's book to understand more of the experience. You know, Wyoming is not the most diverse state in this country. And I think it's important for people in non-diverse states like this to read about what's going on in the rest of the country, because we're really becoming one. And another book that I found fascinating, coming from the South, was a book by a retired general who taught at West Point many years. It's called Robert E. Lee and Me, and it's The Myth of the Lost Cause. And he really sets forth how after Reconstruction, the history and the narrative and the glorification of the Confederacy came to be when it shouldn't have, and the glorification of the generals who fought and commanded troops to actually kill United States troops. We've never glorified a country that attacked the United States of America the way that we have. And it's Ty Seidel wrote it, S-E-I-D-U-L, and it's Robert E. Lee and Me. It's a fascinating book, and it's an easy read, and it's historically annotated to make sure people know that he's given facts. He gives some opinions in there, but he gives some facts. I think those two are very, very good.
Meaghan, anything for us to take a look at?
Well, there's this book called the We the People book that
Okay,
I really
all
think
right.
is fabulous if you are needing more constitutional information.
Circling back to the top of the show, that's all right.
But totally, I guess it could be kind of related to women and overcoming barriers. But just for pleasure, I read Educated by Tara Westover, and that was
Great book.
such a strong memoir. So mostly just for pleasure, but it was incredibly challenging about the human spirit. So just mostly if you need something, I wouldn't call it light, but worth reading.
Senator Doug Jones, Meaghan Todd, Dr. David Adler, thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to Wyoming to give your knowledge to Wyoming and North Dakota social studies teachers, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.